The Center for Baptist Leadership broadcast live stream. Today, we are going to be discussing what was an incredibly dark day in American history yesterday when anti ICE leftist mobs stormed a Baptist church in St. Paul, Minnesota, as part of ongoing unrest in Minnesota and the Minneapolis and Twin Cities area due to legitimate, lawful, and absolutely crucial law enforcement operations undertaken by our heroic ICE agents. It's been weeks of unrest in the Twin Cities now, and it has come to this: a mob storming a church, disrupting worship, and quite frankly, violating their First Amendment rights and all sorts of other legal protections that churches have, and the expectation that they do have and should enjoy to worship freely in the United States of America without fear of being attacked by a mob like this. We'll be joined by a variety of guests today. We'll be starting with Will Chamberlain and Jon Whitehead to talk about some of the legal ramifications. So please, if you're listening, share this. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, and we'll be back here in just a second.
Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
All right, welcome back to the Center for Baptist Leadership broadcast live stream. I'm your host, Executive Director William Wolfe. Will and Jon, thanks for joining us here today. Why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners, beginning with Will, first-time guest. Glad to have you here today.
Yeah, sure. My name is Will Chamberlain. I'm Senior Counsel with the Article 3 Project and the Internet Accountability Project. I'm also Vice President of External Affairs at the Edmund Burke Foundation, which runs the National Conservatism Conferences.
Great. Will, you're also a prolific poster on X. I aspire to your levels of greatness.
Thank you.
I appreciate that you just, you do not give the left an inch on anything, which is just fantastic. So, yes. Jon, you've been here before, but go ahead and introduce yourself. We had a lot of traction at the CBL account over the weekend, so we might have some new listeners here.
Yeah, lots of folks with CBL will know me. I'm Jon Whitehead. I'm an attorney just outside Kansas City. Most of my practice involves First Amendment issues, especially with churches and religious groups. And so these events are kind of our bread and butter.
All right. So yesterday afternoon, after I got back from a peaceful day at my church here, I saw the news that a leftist anti-ICE mob had essentially, I'm going to use the word attacked a Baptist church. They stormed it. They weren't just protesting, and they had no legal right to be protesting inside the sanctuary anyway. When you guys saw those videos, what was your initial reaction, just as a patriotic American, somebody who believes in the First Amendment? We'll go Will and then Jon.
I mean, well, I was obviously appalled. I think it goes against everything America stands for. And I say that as, the weird secular goofball here, right? Not the religious person, but even as someone who is secular, how can you not look at that and just see that as absolutely disgraceful and disgusting? And I think also my immediate first instinct was that's a federal crime. These people are all going to be jailed, and we can talk more about it. But it struck me as it's the closest thing we've had for left-wing protesters doing something akin to January 6th, both from the sense of this obvious violation of federal law, but also failing to properly conceal themselves while doing so. They were all under the impression that what they were doing was perfectly legal. They are wrong. And they were bragging about their criminal conduct on Facebook. They're easily identifiable. So I expect, just as the January 6th defendants were rounded up over the course of a year, and basically every single person who went into that building found themselves under indictment, I suspect that every single one of those protesters will be identified and eventually indicted by the Department of Justice. That may take weeks, may take months, but it will happen.
Yeah, Jon? I mean, I had a very similar response. I mean, I think we've crossed a line in some ways. I mean, this kind of activity, it used to be the people that would do this were smart enough to wear hoods, right? I mean, they knew they couldn't get away with this in America, and now the fact these protesters think the American political system is a way that they can now march into churches, disrupt activity. It's a clear distinction between good and evil. You see that clearly, but it's obviously concerning now that people think they can march in with their faces unmasked and get away with this. They expect no repercussion. They have some idea the First Amendment protects them here, even when it doesn't. And so that kind of boldness in certain quarters of progressivism means we are at a dangerous place in America.
The idea that the law doesn't apply to the left, I think that's something that's very salient here, because these protesters, and particularly somebody like Renee Good, these leftist agitators, they live in a fantasy land. They truly are like theater kids. They ask, why didn't the ICE agent have rubber bullets? They don't expect to actually be held accountable for their actions. You two are both bright legal minds, and I think you're right. This is a very dangerous moment in American civil life. Just briefly, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where the left clearly does not think that the American judicial system applies to them? Will, and then John.
So that's a very good question. I think it's just generally a lack of action, a lack of prosecutions. And some of that is, there's been a big grievance on the right. I would say that, for example, there's been a lot less action taken against Antifa than there was against the January 6ers. And I always caution people for getting too black-pilled on that. The reason that's true is because the January 6ers were a lot less sophisticated at crime than the Antifa people were. The Antifa people had the intelligence that they have good OPSEC. They show up in masks and they don't bring their phones to their protests. And as a result, when you need to prove that not just that a crime was committed, but who specifically committed it beyond a reasonable doubt, it can be challenging. You have to think about the fact that they're going to get up there and say, that wasn't me. I didn't do that. And how do you know if the guy's masked, if there's no external evidence that they were there? It's not to say it's impossible to prosecute them, but it's a much bigger challenge from the perspective of DOJ. But yeah, I think that, I think the left, but apparently, I think maybe this is really just a different species of the left that never got the message. Maybe this is. I don't think this was Antifa. This was Black Lives Matter, and so maybe this is just a different group of people, really new to the game, who had just had the run of the table for the last 5 years, assumed that they could just do whatever they wanted and nobody would come after them because they'd be called racist, and suddenly they've hit a tripwire and are about to find out.
Yeah, it feels like folks that are so far down their own rabbit hole. Even the idea that they should be able to lawfully protest. Yeah, the First Amendment protects protest. That's you on the sidewalk outside the church, maybe with a sign. That is not you gathering at a mall saying we're having a covert clandestine operation to go in and disrupt services on Sunday morning, and that somehow, as Don Lemon says, children are terrorized, and somehow everyone says, but that's just what protesters do. That is not what the protest has ever meant under the First Amendment or free speech. And you just wonder, where have these people been that they've either gotten away with it or think they've seen people get away with it, that they've come to this conclusion that this is acceptable activity.
Yeah, well, I'd have to think that one of the things that emboldens them is when you have an attorney general like Keith Ellison in Minnesota holding up the book of Antifa, the Antifa book, whatever book it was that he was holding up, praising. I mean, the guy's an absolute subversive actor himself. So if that's the attorney general in your state, I would think, hey, this guy's on my team. He's going to let me get away with whatever I want. Thankfully, we have a federal government that is not so inclined to allow these people to continue to mess around and not find out. So, I had a couple clips. I'm having an issue playing here, but let's dive into sort of what are the stakes here for these protesters. What are the federal crimes that they've committed? And, when we've seen these videos, we obviously saw Don Lemon sort of leading it in many ways, right? I mean, he clearly wasn't the organizer, didn't plan it. Maybe he was a part of it. I don't know. Maybe we'll find that out. But Don Lemon, failed CNN, MSNBC media personality, is there interviewing the protesters, going inside the church, interviewing the pastor. A couple things, Will, that you were saying is things like the FACE Act. So guys, I've seen that thrown around a lot. So we'll do Will and then John. What is the FACE Act? Does it apply here? And what would be the penalties if we can prosecute these disruptors under that?
So the FACE Act is the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. So it was designed primarily to deal with protesters at abortion clinics. Basically, making it a criminal act to obstruct people's getting into or ability to access services, either by blocking their way into blocking their way in, sitting in the middle of the facility, what have you. But in addition, it contains the exact same prohibition on churches. Namely, you're not allowed to go block entrances or block ingress or egress to churches, or use threat or force or the threat of force to impede on people's religious observance. I actually think, having now read it, I think that it actually will be a close question on whether or not what happened in there was a sufficient physical obstruction, because it's not clear they were blocking entry or exit. So but then again, it's a totally new statute. One of the issues here is that my understanding is that prior to this most recent fall, there had never been a federal prosecution under the church's provision of the FACE Act. It had always been only these abortion clinics. So there really is a bunch of new law to explore, and when you're analyzing cases to see whether this applies, you're actually taking these abortion cases and sort of applying them, abortion clinic cases, and applying them to the church context. However, I think it's an absolute slam dunk, frankly, on 18 U.S.C. 241, which is conspiracy against rights. I think that is ultimately, that's why you see Harmeet Dillon talking this morning on Benny Johnson about applying the Ku Klux Klan Act. That's what she's talking about, 18 U.S.C. 241, which says if two or more persons conspire to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate any person, blah, 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 in the free exercise of enjoyment or of any right or privilege secured to him by the Constitution, that's a crime. And that's what happened here. You had a whole group of people attempt knowingly to shut down a session of religious worship for the purposes of shutting it down. They knew that was their purpose. They knew exactly what they were doing. They essentially wanted to use that to blackmail the church to fire this pastor that they thought was involved with ICE. That's a really, really straightforward violation of 18 U.S.C. 241. There's no question about whether or not they were sufficiently physically obstructive in the way they were preventing people from leaving. It's literally just you tried to shut down a service. That's federal crime. Penalties for that, I believe, are max out at 10 years. But when you say a maximum of 10 years, when it actually gets down to the federal sentencing guidelines, you're usually looking for first-time offenders at something like, 6 months to 24 months, something like that.
Okay. Thanks, Will. Go ahead, John.
Well, a couple angles I'd like to talk about. One, talk about the angle of this being an attempt to really not just intimidate the church, but to intimidate a particular member of the church who is a law enforcement officer, to come in and make his life uncomfortable. Talk about kind of that angle, and how does that play into the statutes?
That's an interesting angle that I hadn't thought really a lot about, because I would need to look up what the statute is, but I am confident that there is another law that would prohibit the intimidation of a federal law enforcement officer to prevent him from discharging his duties, right? I'm not sure if that also is exactly the same obstruction statute that potentially, Renee Good would have violated and charged with had she not died as a result of being shot in self-defense, and what her wife Becca Good might actually, in fact, still be charged with if what's coming out. But I would need to look more into it. So I don't want to spitball without having actually read the statute, but I would assume, I would assume that itself would be an independent basis. Now, the interesting question is, I think, all of them probably would have had the specific intent to do that. The entire group seemed to be organized. The whole protest, the point of the protest was that one of the pastors there worked for ICE. So if they thought that, then certainly at least they thought they were intimidating a law enforcement officer to prevent him from performing his duties, or to injure him and to prevent him from holding an office. I think that actually might be, now that I think about it, I think that's a different violation of the Ku Klux Klan Act, actually.
Yeah, the whole angle of the Klan Act, and I think the other interesting thing will be to look in to see what did they organize. Were they organized enough to involve local government? Right? Did the police get a tip off on this? Was there somebody in Minnesota law enforcement that knew this was coming that would have looked the other way? Because if that's the case, then there are so many more remedies under federal law for a conspiracy to kind of deprive people of their civil rights, and that's Will's area of expertise, and that will be just, the discovery will be amazing. And I'm glad to see Harmeet Dillon and her team. Jesus Sosete, I know from his years in Missouri, and those are top-notch people. I'm looking forward to seeing how they prosecute this.
Okay, well, let's talk about the timeline here for a moment, because obviously it was horrific, right? And we've been coming to this, and quite frankly, as I thought about this in preparation to talking to you guys, I just can't believe that nobody got hurt, right? I mean, this is one of those things where it could have gone so sideways. And I'll have a conversation later in this live stream with somebody who helps churches, have better security teams. And it seems like this church maybe should have had a better security team. But if they had armed security guards, this maybe could have gone a different way. I don't know. But in God's providence, it seems like nobody was hurt or seriously hurt. Nobody was certainly shot. So it could have gone a lot worse. The outrage is palpable and understandable. We're seeing these BLM activists, anti-ICE activists shutting down a Christian church. It's a total failure of the government of Minnesota to protect Christians. So people want action, and rightly so. And of course, Will, as you track, and I do too, is the frustration that grows with a lack of immediate action. So thankfully, I feel like we've seen Dylan and others responding swiftly to this. So again, just speak to the severity of it, because I think people would want to hear that, but then also help people understand what sort of the timeline is to expect action on this. We'll go Jon and then Will this time.
Well, I mean, so from my angle, kind of my practice is civil rights remedies. And so I think one of the things that I think will be interesting is, do members of the church sue? Do members of the congregation? Does the individual ICE agent sue? The Klan Act that gives government strong powers also gives strong remedies to people whose civil rights have been violated. And it sure looks here like, for example, there's a provision, 42 USC 1985, that says if there's been a conspiracy to violate civil rights and somebody knows about it in advance and could do something to prevent it and does it, whether they participated or not, if you knew about it in advance and could have done something to blunt the impact of it, you can still be held liable by a court. That looks all day like Don Lemon to me, who's now trying to say, oh, I had a First Amendment right to be there. No, you were in the mall parking lot. You knew what was about to happen, and you should have called the police, and you didn't. And so I think there's probably rights of action by members whose children were terrorized, by the ICE agent who's in the church, suffering, being intimidated for his job. There are rights there that need to be vindicated. And in this case, because again, as I've said, this was not run-of-the-mill conduct. I think it's important that something happens, that those church members, if they couldn't vindicate their security with a security team yesterday, they vindicate their rights using the courts, showing the right way to protect civil rights in America. When your civil rights have been violated, you go to a court, you get a ruling, you get a judgment. You don't engage in petty violence and petty disruption of the lawful conduct of other Americans. So I think timeline there, that could be years. Timeline on prosecutions, maybe Will has a better idea about how fast we can expect to see something.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I saw some people demanding prosecutions immediately, like they wanted people arrested by the end of the night. You can't. My understanding is federal grand juries don't operate on weekends, and you need to, before you can arrest somebody, you need, it's unless they're actually committing a crime in the presence of a law enforcement officer. If you're actually going to go say, we saw that person on video commit a crime, you need to go get a warrant from a judge. You need to get an actual indictment. So it's going to take days to weeks. But honestly, I think probably by Tuesday, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody gets indicted on Tuesday. I think, because I will say this, within 15 minutes of me pinging Harmeet Dillon about this, she was posting about it. By the end of the evening, I had civil rights attorneys in her division calling me to follow up on some of the things that I had posted about. And this is Sunday night. So they are on it. Apparently there are 2 civil rights attorneys on their way to Minneapolis. There's a FBI team involved. I think, here's the other thing I would say, because there's been so much frustration and so much difficulty in bringing indictments in other cases, and you see that you can't do this half-assed. Pardon my language. Sorry. Will told me not to.
Will. It's okay.
Right. Well, keep going. I know this is a Baptist channel. Excuse my momentarily.
No worries. Just keep going.
Anyway, unprepared. You don't want to do this in an unprepared fashion, because the end result of that is maybe your indictment doesn't succeed. So as a result, we've had struggles elsewhere. But here you finally got a case where you've got very, very clear federal crimes committed and no question about who committed them. And just like after January 6th, I think the first indictments rolled out within 48 hours, something like that. And then they proceeded. People have to remember, The J6 indictments that indicted everybody there, they proceeded over the course of years. It took years to get through every single person because there's just a block of prosecutorial effort that you need to do for each individual defendant that's not replaceable. And so it's like a machine. You kind of ramp it up over, you're going to get more and more lawyers into it, doing it and working on the project. But, you know, to maybe indict 40 people, I suspect you could probably get through all those indictments in months. My guess would be probably, I think you could probably get every indictment done if you were able to identify all 40 people in short order. Probably 6 months until we see all the indictments completed, and then prosecutions happening over the course of the next year or two. I don't think there'll be very complicated prosecutions. The evidence is all on video.
Yeah, I mean, again, that point is amazing. Like Don Lemon has done us an incredible service here in broadcasting this entire thing and becoming really the face of it. How important is it that Don Lemon in particular goes to jail over this for the sake of the American Republic?
I think it serves an important teaching function. I think Adrian Vermeule has discussed this before. The law is a teacher among many other things, and enforcing the law teaches the public of what kind of conduct is acceptable. And, you know, for the same reason, I think it's very important that the federal government prosecute Becca Good, the widow of Renee Good, because there's this impression among large portions of the American public that the law enforcement officer might have committed a crime. And I think the DOJ needs to stand and teach a large chunk of the American public that no, in fact, actually, the only crimes here were committed by those who are obstructing law enforcement and trying to impede them and treating their safety as irrelevant. So similarly here, I think it's important that Don Lemon serve as an example for everybody else that just because you're a journalist doesn't mean you get to waltz into a place of worship, barge in, interrupt the pastor, demand answers from him, demand answers from other people in the church, be part of this broader conspiracy of people who shut down a religious service. That's not acceptable conduct. That's criminal conduct, regardless of the fact if you're a former CNN anchor. So I think it's important that it is important that he be prosecuted. I mean, I will defer. I start with the president's I defer. I know Harmeet Dillon. I know she's an incredible lawyer and she will prosecute every prosecutable case. So if she decides this one isn't prosecutable for whatever reason, I'll defer to that judgment. But I do think, you know, from the outside, I do think it's important that that Lemon be prosecuted.
Yeah, I mean, even if Harmeet didn't take it up criminally, I think it's important to do it civilly, right? I mean, I think this idea that the First Amendment gives rise to violent intimidation and disruption has spread widely. I mean, we've seen this in law schools, unfortunately, in places like Yale and Stanford, where conservative speakers come in, and there was a wave of disruptive protest, and thankfully, administrators in most of those cases have come down on the right side, but we still have this era of lawyers, of progressive advocates who think for whatever reason that it is my First Amendment right to terrorize children, in their own words. It's my First Amendment right to break up lawful conduct, religious worship services. That idea has, for whatever reason, found fertile ground in certain areas of the progressive movement. And it's important that the legal process be used to prove that's wrong, right? We had a religious liberty lawyers will know the Lemon test as a test that we all hated over the years because it was so imprecise. I'd like to see a new Lemon test, which is if Don Lemon is doing it, it's probably not legal. You shouldn't be doing what Don Lemon did. If it looks like the Don Lemon situation, it's time for you to rethink your plans. So a new Lemon test would be a good development, I think.
Well, that's really helpful, guys. And I think you're right. I mean, it seems that the administration and Harmeet Dillon in particular are on the ball here. So let's give them some time, let them cook, let them slice this lemon up and see where it lands. But it's terrible lemon puns here today. You started it, John. Okay. So we need to see Lemon prosecuted. Obviously, I think it's incredibly important. We see the organizers of this attack, prosecuted as well. To pull the camera back out just for a second here, I mean, what is going on in the state of Minnesota at large? I mean, it's just, it is the ugly, underbelly of, American Antifa and lawless activity right now. What can be done? And Will, maybe you have a beat on this. Maybe you do too, John. Obviously, Mayor Fry in Minneapolis, the mayor of St. Paul, Tim Walz, of course, has created the conditions that have led to this. They are responsible. The left is responsible. And so beyond just prosecuting this discrete case and putting the people who attacked City's Church in jail, hopefully for a long time, What can the administration do to sort of bring Minnesota to bear and get this nightmare under control?
Yeah, there's a good amount that they're already doing, and that I think the biggest thing, they just need to continue doing what they're doing, because what they're doing is working. As much as it can be frustrating to see, people rioting in the streets, what they're being very aggressive on a few fronts. First off, they've started a formal investigation of Tim Walz and Jacob Frey on the question of whether or not they've participated in conspiracies to obstruct law enforcement. Now, people are saying, "Oh, that's First Amendment protected." What they've said, it's like, no, you're not getting it. What they've said does not, in and of itself, reveal the existence of such a conspiracy, and what they've said in public is not indictable. But what they've said gives rise to some inferences that behind the scenes they might well be coordinating with these lawless groups. If they are, that would be criminal. So that's what's being investigated. I think that'll do a good thing in terms of reminding everybody in Minnesota state government that, yeah, you're right. Under our Constitution, you are not obligated to help federal law enforcement put people away. As sensible and as reasonable as it might be to do that, kind of give that help, as impractical as your position is, you're not obligated to do that. But what you are not allowed to do is obstruct federal law enforcement, and we are allowed to be there. And we're so lucky. This is why the One Big Beautiful Bill was so important. Winning any conflict requires the will to do so and the means to do so. The administration has the will, and because of the One Big Beautiful Bill, they have the means. If the Minnesota Police Department says, well, we're not going to give you any of our 600 people to assist in your law enforcement, because we have all these resources, the Department of Homeland Security can be like, that's fascinating. We're going to send 2,000 people, and we're going to overwhelm the population of the criminal population of Minneapolis with as many agents as is necessary to enforce the law. And if you try and stop us, then you're committing a federal crime. So, there's been this too cute game being played by sanctuary jurisdictions for a long time, which is underpinning the idea of, if we don't cooperate, it's too hard for you to operate in our environment. And so you basically, if we refuse to cooperate, we can thwart immigration enforcement in our jurisdiction. That's not true anymore as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill. And what's happening in Minnesota is demonstrating it. I think it actually would be more useful to kind of withhold on the Insurrection Act unless it's absolutely necessary, and just demonstrate that we don't need to bring in the military. We literally have everything we need, and we are going to stay here until we've finished our mission, just using the normal authorities granted to us. And anybody who tries to obstruct us, we're going to throw the book at you. I think that's the sort of way, that's the way they should approach it. And eventually, I think eventually we just win. We have the means, we have the will. Eventually we will just win. And there's no need to use the Insurrection Act, in my view, unless the local and state authorities really escalate what they're doing to an actual affirmative rebellion, rather than sort of this kind of tentative tiptoeing around it.
Yeah, no, I'm in Missouri. I don't have a good opinion about what's gone wrong in Minneapolis, other than just watching aghast as essentially the grandchildren of Lake Wobegon have gone nuts, and what's happened up there, I'm not quite sure, but obviously bad leadership, making bad decisions, is not helping things, and kudos to the administration for trying to rein that in.
Yeah, well, I was interested. Thanks, John. Too. I was interested about the Insurrection Act, because it's something. It's one of those things. I certainly have tweeted my fair share of invoked the Insurrection Act as but I like to do that. I like to put the pressure on. Right. It's also, but like, what would trigger that? Like, say for example, if say one of the members at this church yesterday had been killed by one of these agitators. Is that the kind of thing that we think we're waiting for to see? Because I mean, that again, that's not necessarily a state agent of Minnesota, sort of subverting the federal government. It's a powder keg there. I mean, it clearly is, and it hasn't stopped for weeks now. And of course, we can't lose sight that behind all of this is the massive Somali immigration and fraud scandal. Right. That's what they're in there to do. They're in there to clean out some of the worst in terms of, foreign invaders that are milking the American taxpayers. So, is there what's the trip line? Help educate the people like myself out there and others. What's the trip line for the Insurrection Act? It's not just a terrible incident. It's something specific with Minnesota officials.
Well, honestly, the trip line is just President Trump's discretion about whether he wants to do it. There's no legal tripwire in the sense of it is. I think if I don't have the statute in front of me, but if I recall, it's whenever the president finds that he is unable to execute the laws due to rebellion or something like that. But it's I know that it's a presidential finding, and so and it's one that's given a lot of deference. So it's really just President Trump making the decision that he thinks it's necessary. And so it's really just up to him. I mean, and whether he thinks that at a certain point the military is necessary, that ICE resources are insufficient. So that's, I think, the real time to do that. It's prudentially, I think the time to do that would be actual affirmative rebellion by the Minnesota authorities. Like if you actually started seeing Minnesota police not just not participating, but actively working against ICE. If you saw there, all this talk about the National Guard being called up to stand up to ICE if they ever tried to pull a stunt like that, that would be a great time to invoke the Insurrection Act. That would be formal rebellion against federal authority. But in the absence of that, and in the absence of a need to, right? Because again, I think we're so used to being blackpilled about these protests happening and nothing being done about them, but that's not what's happening in Minnesota. Actually, it seems like every time somebody steps over the line from peaceful protest into violence, and we can identify who they are, they're getting prosecuted. And moreover, there's no retreat. Every day, Bovino and every other person in Customs and Border Patrol and ICE is on the streets doing more. We're not letting this shootings stop us. We're not letting all the protests stop us. We're just going to keep finding and detaining criminal aliens and kicking them out of the country until there aren't any more criminal aliens left in Minnesota, and then we'll move on to another city to clear out the criminal aliens there. Not saying that we should stop there, but like we're certainly going to keep going in Minnesota until the criminal aliens are gone. And I think that's the right move.
Thanks, Will. John?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think these are professionals, right? The breath of fresh air about the second Trump administration has been the quality of individuals in the administration, and slowly tightening the screw is what eventually accomplishes the mission. I personally think we'll go through a whole other set of laws before you get to the Insurrection Act that gives government the tools for what it needs, right? So I think if you just keep tightening the screw, eventually the problem will resolve itself. There's enough power there, even on the Klan Act, right? There are certain provisions of the Klan Act that give the president authority to send in troops or put down rebellion. So I think there are other tools there before we get to that. I mean, that is a big deal. I don't mean to understate that. I think these are professionals. They know what they're doing. They're tightening the screws, and as long as that keeps happening, there's will and there's a way to do it. Like Will said, I think that's the most important thing.
Great. Last question for both of you guys, because we're going to move on to a next segment here where we talk about how churches can prepare themselves and their security teams for incidents like these. But what I think that, and John, you would know this, and maybe Will would know it some, but Christians, out of sort of all the religious groups in the United States of America, are one of the groups that is most sort of hesitant to sort of embrace and assert themselves and their rights in many ways. And in many ways, Christians have been, legitimate punching bags. And we've had administrations that have let the left particularly target Christians in particular. So as we watch this unfold, as we watch a church get taken over by a mob like this, as lawyers, and John particularly as a Christian lawyer, what would your advice be to churches and Christian organizations out there on how they can, use the legal system to defend their First Amendment rights and to do it sort of boldly, and why it's so important that they do it for American civil society?
Yeah, I think it's important that evangelical Christians embrace the tools, frankly, God's given them, right? By providence, we have the system. Our confessional documents amongst Baptists say the magistrate is a minister for God's good. God's given us these magistrates, these judges, these officials to protect law and order so that Christianity can flourish. And so when those are challenged, when those are threatened or with disruption, then I think it's good, frankly, to lean into the system God's given us to vindicate the religious rights, not just for ourselves, right? It's not that anyone is particularly mad at Don Lemon, frankly, although you had every right to be. It's that I don't want any other church, I don't want any other parent, I don't want any other child to have to go through this. And we need to lay down the law right now, the rule right now, that this is not acceptable conduct under the law. And if there's any question, then let's take that to the judge and get it decided now, rather than let that fester and have other churches disrupted, others that are perhaps in a worse situation than City's Church. City's Church appears to be a thriving, vibrant congregation with lots of young people in it. But if the next target is not so well situated, like you said, William, if there were physical violence involved or a reaction to physical violence, the next situation could be worse. So I think as a matter of loving your neighbor, frankly, at this point, we're going to embrace prosecution by God's appointed minister, the prosecutors here, and we're going to embrace the system God's given us of magistrates and judges and laws that we can use to protect not just ourselves, but our fellow Christians.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at things. Like I wouldn't dare lecture Baptists on scripture, so I'm not even going to try and argue from that perspective. But I would just say, what I will say is this: I think it's very, very important for the public and for the health of the country that churches who are attacked like this use the full weight of the law to protect themselves, to protect their flocks, and to protect everybody else. I don't want to see. I think it would be really, really a big shame in this country if we had a circumstance where churches had to be protected the same way as synagogues currently do. I think it's really a shame that synagogues have to be protected the way that they are. And I think it's really, really important to as I said, teach the general public. This conduct's not acceptable. We protect worship in this country. We protect the rights of worshipers, and you just don't get to barge in and stop a service because you're really mad about something. It's not something you get to do. You know, take it outside, hold up a sign, be like anybody else. Yeah, it means you can't be as aggressive as you want. You can't succeed in the way you might want to. You can't stop what you want to, but you're not allowed to do that. So.
Well said, guys. Thank you so much for joining. Will, it's great to have you on. Really appreciate it. Appreciate Anytime. Your insights. John, appreciate yours as well. Where can our listeners find and follow both of you?
At Will Chamberlain on X, as William said, I'm a prolific poster, and you can find what I say about this and a variety of other topics. And you can also follow the Article 3 Project. We fight for constitutionalist judges and the rule of law. You can see what we're involved in there at a3p.org.
And you'll probably see me here again soon. I'm J.R. Whitehead on Twitter.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. I'm gonna hide you both from the live stream, and then just make sure you let it upload in your browser before you click out, and you'll be free to go. So thank you guys for joining, and we will see you guys later. All right, thanks for tuning in, folks. That was our brief segment on the legal ramifications of what happened yesterday. But this is going to be a long live stream today. I've never done anything like this before. We're going to go for about 2 hours with 4 different segments. And coming up next, we have Oklahoma State Senator Dusty Deevers and local Baptist former law enforcement official Terry Gant to talk to you about church security and what you need to do to prepare to face a mob like this if, God forbid, it would come your way. So we're going to let Terry and Dusty into the show here now. Guys, welcome. You are live. So any last modifications you need to make to your camera or your mic, go ahead and do that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Terry. Thanks for joining.
All right.
Dusty? I'm getting a little bit of feedback from one of you. Terry, you mind muting yourself for a second? Okay, it is Terry. Dusty, check back in.
How's the sound?
The sound is pretty good. You're a little off-center. Can you center yourself just a little bit more in your car there?
Sure.
There, that's better. That's better. Okay, all right. So, Terry, when you're not talking, if you can just try to mute yourself, because we were getting a little feedback loop there. But we will go ahead and jump right in and have you guys introduce yourselves. While Terry's messing with his mic. Dusty, a lot of folks know you, but go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners today.
Yeah, my name's Dusty Deevers. I am a state senator in Oklahoma, representing District 32. I'm also a pastor here in Southwest Oklahoma at Grace Reformed Baptist Church. It's a Southern Baptist church like City's Church was.
Great. Terry, first time on the podcast. Glad to have you, man. Who are you? What do you do?
My name is Terry Gant. I'm a headmaster of a small classical Christian school in Tennessee, and I attend a Southern Baptist church that's about the same size as City's Church, it looked like. So I'm a former Metro Nashville police officer, and I've been on our church's security team and on a church prior to the one that I'm currently in. I've been on that team as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us here today, guys. So, Dusty, I know security has been something that you've had to think about a lot as well. But let's go to Terry first. So, Terry, you're a former law enforcement official. You help lead your church security team. When you saw this yesterday break out and saw the videos, What were your reactions and initial reactions to that video in terms from a security perspective?
Sure, yeah. From a security perspective, the thing that I noticed is that there didn't seem to be anybody that had any idea what to do, and I'm sympathetic because this is not entirely unprecedented, but it is kind of within our lifetimes unprecedented. So they were just shocked, and so that's I hope that one of the things that comes out of this is that churches can begin to take their security seriously and be thinking about more, because most church security has and in the last several years, the last few decades, has mostly been organized around burglary after hours and the like securing the child wing. If you have like a children's Sunday school wing, there's a lot of places have taken that seriously to avoid abductions or child abuse, but not so much for hardening the building or physical security from determined intruders during a church service. So it didn't seem like anybody really knew what to do. That was a big thing that I noticed right away from a security perspective.
All right, Dusty.
Yeah, I would concur with what Terry said. Look, I hate it for these folks. We have seen over the past decade at least churches having to deal with security measures, and we should have already been woken up to this, but now I think more of the main line, the normie crowd, are going to wake up to the reality that the invaders are not just across our borders and not just in our cities, but they are coming for our churches and our homes, and we have to have a sheepdog protector mentality. And that means you men have to step up and create a security protocol for your church and start working through the various scenarios and game planning those out because you have a duty before God and man to fulfill the sixth commandment, which says, you shall not murder, but it also means you must do everything lawfully to protect yourself and your neighbor. We have gone over the theological side of it with our men. We have a security protocol in place with a security team, and we're happy to discuss some of those things now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dusty. So, Terry, back to you. As somebody who's lived law enforcement and somebody who's helped build a security team at your church, and you've written on this before. I think you've written a couple articles at American Reformer. So, why don't you just give our listeners a little bit of sort of maybe the philosophy behind it? Like, why is this so important? Why is this something you can't ignore? Why is this part of a Christian duty, even part of a church's duty, particularly of the pastors and the leadership of the church, to secure their building for the sake of their congregants, and then how they should go about that?
Sure. So let me know if I'm sounding funny. My mic's misbehaving a little bit. I apologize. But anyway, so I think to start at the most basic level, we have kind of on an ecclesiological level, we have a little bit of an issue and this is something that we've seen that has caused other kinds of problems for a while. And what I mean by that is we tend to think of our churches, especially like the young, restless, Reformed descendants and the just evangelical churches generally see it as their primary outreach mode, which means that they want to throw the doors open and let everyone come in. And that is fine in principle. However, we're now seeing why it's probably best to reanalyze that and to think about the fact that really the church is for its members, and that sharing the gospel with those who come in good faith to seek answers is certainly fine, but you can't just assume that because the church is open on Sunday that it's equivalent to a public park where anyone can just come in. You have the ability to say no. You have the ability to say, we want people to come in that are here to worship or here to ask legitimate questions, but not just anybody gets to come in. You don't have free access to our church. And so that, I think, is a big part of the mental shift that people are going to have to make, of thinking of their church as protected territory for their congregants, for their pastors, for their flocks. That it's a place that needs protection and defense, and not just open to anybody who wants to come in at any time for any reason, on the off chance that they may accidentally hear the gospel, which I've seen those comments on Twitter. We've already seen people saying like, well, these guys might have heard the gospel had they, just kept going with the service. But clearly that's not a realistic goal in most cases.
Yeah. Dusty, anything to add to that?
I think Terry's right. Uh, I think one of the confusions that a lot of churchgoers have and leaders have is that their church is a public space. And that's just not the case. It is a public private space. And in Oklahoma law and a lot of law across the states, it's recognized kind of like a shop owner's. If you own a retail space, you have the right to trespass people. You have the right to take proportional action to protect your church. And not only the right, but you must defend those people. And I used a similar analogy to our guys. There are guests that you welcome into your front door at your house. That's a more private space. You generally know who's crossing the threshold of your house. If you don't know who they are, you are going to take a much more aggressive posture. If it happens in the church, it's a little different because it's a public private space. And in that sense, you want guests there. You want to be welcoming, but you have to know what the baseline is for normal guests. And whenever it's not something that looks in the ordinary, it looks out of the ordinary, your men need to start making contact with these people, vetting them, baselining them, profiling, and then assessing the situation and taking action very quickly. I'll just posture a book. It's called Left of Bang. And we've used some of those left of bang protocols for really baselining and then assessing a scenario and then getting into more strategic action thereafter.
Great, thank you. So Terry, if you're a church watching this incident, and look, I mean, praise God for City's Church Minnesota and for how they at least they stood their ground, sort of physically even with them in the building, and they were speaking and calling it shameful. And there's videos of the pastor doing that. But if you're a church watching that and you think, I want to make sure it never gets to this point, I want to make sure that the agitators, the disruptors, don't get inside, or if they do get inside, we have a strategy and an action plan to remove them peacefully as soon as possible. What does a church need to do to start, preparing a security team to deal with things like this?
Well, I think, the most basic thing, which kind of relates to what I was just saying, which is that churches need to start locking their doors. On Sunday mornings, your church doors should be locked, and there should be somebody on the security team who's assigned to open it for all the people who come in. There's ways that this can be snuck past. In a situation like the one we saw in Minnesota, there would have been a suspiciously large number of people trying to sneak in, looking like they were there to just attend the church. I think that would have tipped them off earlier. I don't know if their doors were locked. My suspicion is that they weren't, because it seemed like the group came in a large chunk, all kind of more or less at the same time. And I think a lot of people just think, well, you can't lock the church doors because somebody might want to come in. But it's very easy to just have someone sitting there. And then if a large group approaches, it looks like they're up to no good, you just don't open the door. Or you step outside and ask them what they need. And, a big part of this would be, and this is one of the problems that they had in Minneapolis, is that I would be surprised if they had a healthy relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department. And that's not a dig against the actual guys on the front lines, the cops themselves, but clearly there's a discrepancy between doing justice and the people who are currently in power in Minneapolis city government. And so they're ordering the police to stay away and to stay out of the way and to lay low. And so they, where I live, we have a good relationship with our sheriff and police department. And so we know that they would respond if we called them and said, there's a large crowd that's formed outside and we don't know what they want, but they're clearly not here to worship legitimately. Can you please send help? And they would. But it's very easy to just lock the doors. And then if they begin to take aggressive action to break in the doors, then you have another situation there where more force may be authorized, and the police, even if they're not necessarily friendly to the church, will respond to an attempted break-in more likely.
Yeah, I mean, so that's an incredibly practical piece of advice, lock the doors, but also that presupposes that you have people that are on a security team that are going to lock the doors, going to stand guard over the doors. Dusty, as somebody who has, had a profile on the rise here, state senator and a Baptist pastor. What does the security team at your church look like? Do you have a deacon of security? I mean, I think really we can speak in Baptist language here, right? Like in my opinion, the individual in the church that oversees something like this is a deacon, because deacons are there to serve the church in these practical administrative ways. So do you have a deacon of security? Do they have, monthly meetings, protocols? Do you ensure that, X number of individuals are armed at your services each time? What does that look like for you guys there?
Yeah, we do have a deacon over security, and we have a large security team, all trained and ready to respond with whatever force or situation arises, even if it's medical. They also carry, beyond their firearms, they carry tourniquets and other first aid gear in case something did happen, or if we just had a medical event as well. And I'll say, when we're selecting our men who are on the security team, the profile really is we want them to be temperate and self-controlled and possess tactical patience and the ability to endure intense verbal abuse even without losing their cool, while remaining ready to act physically in a split second. So you've got their internal makeup, but you also have their external skill set. And we really have a lot of military guys in our area because we're next to Fort Sill. A lot of members are military, former military. We look for law enforcement guys or guys with a high level security background. And then whenever we're doing our trainings and we're bringing in other men, we assess their training and their ability to do the various tasks that are required for this office. Beyond that, then every Lord's Day, we have a multi-tiered, a layered response. And our tier one is our outer men who are the overt security. They are in the parking lot, they're roaming the buildings, and they're acting as that frontline deterrent. Often, many of these things are alleviated due to just a simple deterrence. We've got cameras around the building. Our tier two is the inner space, and our front line on the inside, and they are our greeters that are there in the foyer, or they're interspersed among the body, so that they know if a particular threat presents itself in a certain location, we know who's going to respond first. We know what the rest of the protocol is. If I'm in the pulpit or whoever's preaching, we have a code word that we respond to, that we say, and there's a response immediately that takes place. I've had to do that before. Thankfully, nothing there panned out. And that's generally where our makeup is. We have training for those various tactical situations. We've even trained some of our young boys. We have a thing called Virtus Academy, where it's from kids all the way up to 18, and we train them on clearing rooms and doing tactical training for their own homes, so that they would also be aware if something was going down in our church. Because in some ways, we hate to say it, our church has become a target due to my public profile. We are ready to take on that offense.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So, Terry, do you lead something like that at your church? Do you have a deacon who does it?
Well, we have 4 deacons and 3 of them are on the security team. So I don't know. I guess there's probably one guy that I would say is in charge of it. We don't call him a deacon of security, but he's kind of the point man on it. And so, it's similar, kind of a similar arrangement. It doesn't sound like we're as organized as Dusty's church, but we are also probably a smaller number in a smaller building. But we do have multiple lines, so cameras is a thing that's important. And honestly, when churches are thinking about security, they need to think practically. What is the more likely scenario? If you're in Minneapolis downtown, a riotous mob is unfortunately a more likely scenario for you than it is for me where I am. We're still more likely to be victimized by a simple property crime. And so for us, cameras, having the exterior of the building well lit, a security system that monitors windows and doors. Those are all very, very simple things that can be done that a church should take advantage of. And for us, again, when we were thinking about our specific security situation, we thought, how would we respond if we had someone who came from the media? We had some hostile media coverage in recent days. And so, what do we, and this is not a threat to life, right? But it is someone who's probably there to try to destroy the reputation of the church. How do you handle it? How do you handle it in a way that's not going to get the people who do handle it into legal trouble? And so we have planned out what to do with that. We've planned out what to do if we have, for example, an obvious transgender person come to the store to the church and just try to disrupt by being present, not even being militant, but just trying to be offensive by just being there. What do you do with those kinds of people? And so we have we have a similar deal. We've got an AED on the wall for medical things. We've got I don't want to reveal too much detail about all the specifics that we've got, but we have, like I said, multiple lines, and medical is more likely to be needed than defensive weaponry use, but that's still possible. So we have that as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it really, there's a variety of different sort of subjects or situations, right? So it's like incidents, right? So what is your incident response if you have a member of the hostile media trying to scope out your church, which is on one end of the spectrum? An active shooter incident is on the other end of the spectrum. A medical emergency is somewhere in between, protesters. But again, these are the type of things that churches absolutely need to think through. They need to start a security team. They need to chart out the likelihood of the different security incidents that they could encounter, and they need to have prepared responses for each one of them. And really, this is in many ways, I feel like a product of living in the negative world. This isn't something churches had to think about in the positive world in America. But if what happened yesterday to City's Church doesn't wake you up, I don't know what will. So guys, just with your closing comments here, last encouragements for churches looking to take this seriously and start security teams.
Well, I guess I'll start. I would just reiterate, start thinking of your church as your church and not as everybody's church. Certainly welcome visitors and guests with wisdom. And just kind of to echo Dusty, I think step one, once you've made that mental jump, is to identify the guys in the congregation that will do this well and take it seriously. And once you've got those guys on a team, then you can start really getting on, hit the ground running on planning. And what his qualifications for it, I mean, honestly, it doesn't sound that dissimilar from elder, frankly. I mean, it's somebody who is self-controlled. They are going to have the moral courage to take action should action be necessary, but they also are not hot-headed. That's important. You don't want somebody who's just looking to beat people up either. Those people need a different kind of pastoring. And so once you get that team together, they'll have ideas. And, the pastors need to start thinking about coaching their congregation on being in compliance with sometimes onerous security measures. Having to come knock on the door when you're used to just walking in is tedious for a couple of weeks. But, be telling them that this is the world we live in now, and that this is something that's being done for their protection and comfort while they're here, able to worship the Lord and focus on that.
Well said. Thank you, Terry. Dusty?
Yeah, I would say as pastors, as church members, we have to reject the cowardly submission that masquerades as piety. Biblical love is not passive. It is protective. We all have a charge from God to protect our own families, to protect our churches, to protect our nation. And that doesn't end whenever you walk in the church doors. Get your loves rightly ordered. Protect the saints who are there. Know your state laws, because state laws vary. There are federal laws that John and Will talked about earlier, but there are state laws that protect these as well. So know your state laws about using lethal force. Know your state laws about reasonable and excessive force, and know your state laws about, like in Oklahoma, we have your stand your ground law, and that applies to religious meetings as well. Know what happens whenever there's a disruption for a religious meeting. And if you will know those, you'll be better armed intellectually, and you'll be able to move forward in confidence to protect your people. Read things like Left of Bang. That's a good posture for setting a security mindset. And then start going through those tactical protocols and trainings, run through scenarios like the scenario you saw here in Minneapolis, disruptive rioters or shady characters or active threats. Know what those are. Then get a tool belt ready. Get your comms with your radios, get your medical in place, get your force weaponry in place and those tools. Know how to use your presence and verbal commands, how to use hand signs and body control, and how to use less lethal force if you need to. And I'll just say, men, we have to wake up. Unless we repent of our apathy and our fear of man, we are going to lose the freedom to worship in our nation. You have to build a frontline culture of sheepdogs, and that's what your security team is. You need to build your church where they have the expectation that you're going to respond, that the women and the children feel like they're not only protected, but they put the expectation on you to respond quickly. And then you need to build relationships with your local law enforcement officers so you can text them immediately when something like this happens. You call 911 and your security team is already working. Step up, men.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. This is very helpful. I hope the people listening to this are encouraged and emboldened by it. Terry, thanks so much for joining us today. Glad to have you on for the first time here. Dusty, always glad to have you on too. Terry, we'll make sure to put a link to your articles in there. If Dusty, I feel like what you just covered, if you are able to type up just a little like ... that'd be super helpful for people. Guys, I'm going to go ahead and hide you from the show and just make sure you let it upload, till it finishes in the background. Guys, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, William.
All right, next up, we've got Willy Rice. Many of you guys will know Willy from previous appearances on the Center for Baptist Leadership podcast. His work as an outspoken conservative leader advocating for necessary reforms in the Southern Baptist Convention. We're really honored to have Willy here today. Let's go ahead and let him into the show. Willy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, William. It's good to see you again. It's good to be with you today. Although it's obviously been a momentous weekend for all of us, a heavy weekend, but very honored to be here with you today.
Yeah, it is a heavy, it's a heavy weekend. It's very unfortunate, in this role that I fill with Center for Baptist Leadership, trying to help people process events, respond appropriately. Sometimes it's hard to just pause and feel the weight of these things. And so, Willy, you're a pastor, right? So glad to get you in here. You're a senior pastor down there in Florida. As a pastor, as somebody who I trust would hate to have something like this happen to your church, what did you feel for, fellow pastor Jonathan Parnell as you watch this mob take over his church there at City's Church in St. Paul?
Right. I think you can't help but think, what if I was in that situation? What if this happened to us? You always think about that as a parent when you hear about one of these school incidences, how would we handle it? But as a pastor, you think about it. And boy, we've had, every pastor's probably had some disturbances from maybe a disturbed person or something that's happened. But to have a full-blown protest like this, a group of people that just kind of work their way into a worship service. I think people are forgetting, William, just a few months ago, there was a shooting in Minneapolis at a Catholic church with a deranged transgender activist that shot and murdered children. This is just, what has that been, a couple months? So this is a city in which Christians are probably on edge, a little nervous. Obviously, that's in the background. And then to have this happen, you don't know what's going to happen. So I thought, by the way, I don't know the pastor, but I thought he handled it so well. He showed extraordinary composure, didn't he? Because it would have been easy to get angry, start pushing. I'm not sure I would have killed my composure as well as he did. But he was extremely composed. But you just feel for the safety of your people, first of all. And of course, emotionally, they were very, very traumatized. So I certainly just feel for that congregation, the children, the people who are there just to come to worship. They just wanted to come and worship. We all saw the pictures of the children there. I just felt terrible for that church. And you can't help but think about how we would have responded if it happened here.
Yeah, that's well said, and I trust that many people are praying for City's Church. It certainly seems like that there's been an outpouring of prayer and support for them, for their pastor, Jonathan Parnell, and for the other people involved. And really, what a horrible sort of motive here. These protesters agitators are claiming that there's somebody on staff there at the church who also works for ICE. I'm not confirming or denying that. I don't know if that's the case or not per se, for the purpose of this broadcast. But is that something a pastor can't do, Willie? Could a lay elder
Oh,
not
goodness.
not serve in ICE? Is that outside of the boundaries for Christians in
No,
America?
of course not. It's I mean, let's remember, ICE is a law enforcement arm of the federal government. They have a law enforcement responsibility. So, I mean, we have church members that are part of the sheriff's department, the police department. I've had some that work for prosecutors, FBI, all kinds, and of course, military. I mean, so you were thankful for those people. Those people we're honored that they serve in our church. And then for a pastor, I don't know if it's again, I don't know the situation just like you, and that's it for another broadcast in terms of whether they had a pastor who served there or not. I don't have firsthand information of that, but for maybe a bivocational pastor or a pastor who serves in a non-vocational role to serve in that way, absolutely, it's not inconsistent. In fact, it's an honorable profession. We should be praying for them. We should be supporting them. We should be thankful for them. And just a horrendous motivation by these protesters.
Yeah, well, I agree. And so again, as a pastor, try to get some theological rebuttals to some of the things I've seen here. I've seen some people on the left side of things saying, you cannot serve. Jesus says you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve both Christ and ICE. I've also seen people invoke Jesus, flipping the tables in the temple as sort of a theological justification for these protesters. So how would you, as a theologian and a pastor, dismantle those?
Well, both of those are just completely absurd. First of all, to say that a person can't serve in law enforcement and be a follower of Christ or be a pastor is absurd. It is a noble, worthy profession. They are serving the interest of our country. They're serving the interest of our community. And however people want to politicize this and demonize ICE, it is absolutely invalid. We thank God for those men and I suppose women who serve in that role. I know the Director of Homeland Security, Secretary Noam. These are people of integrity. They're people of courage. They're people of bravery. Look, people can have disagreements as to what government should and shouldn't do, but and how they should do it. And there is a valid place in our courts to make various arguments and in the political realm to make various arguments. But to say that it is somehow inconsistent with Christianity to be a law enforcement officer is absolute nonsense. It is to demonize law enforcement, and that is absolutely absurd. And then, I've heard that argument about flipping over tables. I've heard it to justify riots and social violence. But of course, that is not what that is about at all. That was Jesus challenging the Old Testament temple. And it does not justify the destruction of other people's property. It does not justify denying other people's civil rights. And so we just reject that out of hand. It's amazing how many people that don't believe the Bible, don't want to live by the Bible, love to quote the Bible to create some kind of political justification. But it absolutely doesn't work here. And we shouldn't be intimidated by that.
Yeah, well said. So I do think that this incident is a sort of a flashpoint for Southern Baptists in particular. And, this was a Southern Baptist church, not, in a Southern Baptist stronghold state by any means, right? In Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, St. Paul, outside of Minneapolis, this wasn't Alabama, all right? This wasn't Florida. But still, this is one of our Southern Baptist convention churches.
Yep.
And these debates about immigration and ICE and things like this have been swirling in the Southern Baptist Convention, debates about how protesters should or shouldn't respond to different flashpoints in American life. So what do you think? How do you think Southern Baptists should take this? Because, I was in Washington, D.C. after George Floyd. There were, I remember people after Ferguson. We saw a lot of Southern Baptists pastors and major leaders sort of almost siding with the BLM protesters that time. And these were BLM protesters this time too. This was like BLM anti-ICE.
Yep.
So is this a wake-up call for us as Southern Baptists? Is there a way we need to start changing how we view sort of the radical left in America? What's your takeaway here?
I think it is a wake-up call. I think it's a wake-up call for mainstream conservatives. I think it's a wake-up call, maybe not a wake-up call for reforming conservatives. They've maybe been saying some of this for a while. But I think everybody now who is with conservative biblical conviction is waking up to realize we are all together under an enormous threat. And leftism is not your grandfather's liberalism. This is not Gerald Ford versus Jimmy Carter. This is not, the liberalism that some people recognize in the latter part of the 20th century. This is a leftism that is much more like a communist party. It is much more like the radicals of Europe. It's much more following the playbook of radicals that have been written for generations. And I know communist is a pejorative term, but I'm using it here. It's out of that kind of a playbook. I actually heard a leader say, not recently, not long ago, that, and I don't know where she got this quote. It may have been AOC or one of those kind of national Democratic leaders, that you really didn't have to get a majority. All you really need is about 2 or 3% of a population that's willing to go to the streets, and you can turn an entire society. And that is exactly what leftists try to do. They try to create so much disruption, so much pain, so much panic, that they hope that people in the middle of the road just say, look, we just want peace. Will everyone go back? So what do we need to do? In the last few years, William, a lot of us in the evangelical community, our empathy, our compassion, our values were weaponized against us. And some people saw it and pointed it out, and other people maybe were a little slower to see it. And that's what happened in the Black Lives Matter movement. That's what happened in George Floyd. You see things and you move to compassion, you care about people. And that somehow then blinds us to what is really going on. And that's kind of what happened over the last few years. And my hope is that more and more evangelicals are waking up to that you're being played, you're being fooled, you're being manipulated, your emotions and your values are being used against you, hoping that you will make bad judgments. We all care about people. If you're a Christian, you care about people. You care about marginalized people. You care about migrants, and you care about immigrants. Of course you do. Of course you have compassion on people. But what we're learning now is that illegal immigration is not compassionate. In fact, it's not only bad for Americans, it's bad for people who are migrating illegally. It's abusing people. It's trafficking people. It's absolutely mistreating people who want to migrate in a legal and orderly fashion. These are people who are trying to do it the right way, and it's like standing in line and then somebody just keeps cutting in line. And you want to talk about the human trafficking that was happening under the Biden administration. It's like modern day slavery. So when you see a story and your compassion is weaponized against you, it's causing you to miss the larger issue here. Our country certainly has a right to have legal laws that enforce an orderly, civil process for legal immigration. And those laws have to be enforced for the good of everyone. And we should not allow our empathy or our compassion to be weaponized into making a foolish decision.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We have had our empathy and our compassion weaponized against us. And, the people that have been forgotten are the American citizens, are the people being trafficked. For years, you and I have both seen it. The rhetoric from many leaders in the Southern Baptist Convention or broader evangelicalism has been to focus on the marginalized or to focus on the migrant at the complete expense of the American citizen. Where is the compassion for the American citizen? And then when we have, incidents like yesterday, well, it just puts it on clear display. Like, here are Southern Baptist brothers and sisters. And really, this is the fruit of wokeness. If you've been defending wokeness, if you've been excusing it, if you've been saying things like, riots is just the language of the unheard, which is something I heard like Southern Baptist leaders say, well, here comes, they got heard yesterday in the church, and thank the Lord, nobody got hurt. So, Willie, you're running, you've announced that you're willing to be nominated. as the next president of the Southern Baptist Convention. This is the first time we're talking publicly since that happened. So is this sort of part of why you're running? Obviously, we have a lot of issues to deal with in the Southern Baptist Convention unto the SBC, but are you looking to sort of help change the culture in the SBC on issues like these?
Yeah, absolutely. And look forward to talking to you and talking to, others as well. Over the next few months is kind of what you do if you're a candidate for an office like this, is you talk to a whole lot of people. And of course, I've always enjoyed our conversations, and they've been very fruitful, and I appreciate what you do, William. I do. I've described it as almost a woke riptide that happened in Florida. We know about riptides. A riptide is like an invisible current in the water that sucks you out to the deep water. And people don't intend to get in it. They don't want to get in it. But every year we have people drown in our beaches because usually it's a riptide. It's a massive current you can't see, and you get in it and it pulls you where you don't want to go. You and I have had these conversations. I've been very vocal and honest on podcasts with you before that riptide affected a lot of people. I even think it affected me. I know it did. When you talk to Southern Baptists about racial unity, every Southern Baptist is going to raise their hand and say, man, I want to work for racial unity and reconciliation. The sexual abuse crisis was Exhibit A. When you talk about sexual abuse, every Southern Baptist that I know of is going to raise their hand and say, hey, I want to be about stopping sexual abuse. But what we realized is when you volunteer to do those things, that the people pushing some of those agendas were not trying to primarily stop sexual abuse. There was a bigger agenda afoot, and it wasn't primarily about racial reconciliation. I've never known a Southern Baptist Convention that wasn't working on racial reconciliation. It was more about a political philosophy and a political strategy. Critical theory was that undercurrent riptide that was pulling people out. And I think moments like this, William, are those wake up moments that people who maybe they haven't really been vocal. Maybe they've been a little nervous about some of the criticisms that have been offered. I understand that, but they're waking up. They're waking up. Mainstream conservatives are waking up and saying, okay, we did get played here. We did get fooled. We did get manipulated. And it's not a lack of compassion to be convictional, to be courageous. As I said, it's actually good for everybody. It is loving our neighbor to stand on our convictions and to stand with courage and to stand with clarity. And that's what we need. We could give many, many examples of the last 10 years. But what we need going forward is a convention that is less trying to please a popular mob and is more interested in standing on what we know to be true and what we know to be right.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happened, and everything you just said about sort of racial reconciliation and then the so-called sex abuse crisis has been played on us on immigration too, in particular.
Yep.
And we saw this with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of previous iterations and their advocacy for things that could amount to amnesty, essentially did amount to amnesty. We saw a lot of advocacy from them in prior years, primarily again for the migrants, illegal or legal, and not so much for the well-being of American citizens. I actually have been encouraged by some of the changes that we've seen. And I'd like for you to speak to that too, because, I think that we both know a lot of people have been discouraged by the state of things in the Southern Baptist Convention. Some people think it's fine. The people I talk to are more discouraged. But slowly but surely, we're seeing, I think, a little bit of a change here, even in some of the reaction to what happened yesterday from NAM and even from the ERLC. So and I will have to say, I do think that pressure, that change comes from pressure from people willing to say, hey, we're going in the wrong direction. Okay, I'm sorry you don't like me saying that, but we are. And slowly but surely things turn around. So are you seeing some of that change already?
Well, yeah, I think everybody's kind of in the SBC been on the same page about this. And it's one of those moments that here's what I'm praying, that it's catalytic. To me, the movement that we need to move things in the right direction is that the group I call mainstream conservatives and reforming conservatives realize, hey, we have a lot in common here. We have a common enemy, and they're coming after every one of us who hold to biblical convictional values. And so that is what can pull us together. So I'm grateful for their voices. I think what Southern Baptists are looking for is people who say, hey, I got it. I may have gotten some things wrong. the people who are talking about critical theory, the people who are warning us about wokeness, they were right. And I don't think they want people who just kind of move on as if nothing happened. Like, please forget everything that happened the last 10 years. I think we need to say collectively, really, not everyone got it wrong, of course, but collectively, we need to say, hey, we got some things wrong. We were weakened in our position. And it's not just a perception of a few people who are just noisy and disenfranchised. I'm telling you already, I'm talking to a lot of pastors, and you're right. There are a lot of pastors who are very, very concerned, and they feel like that we weakened in our resolve, in our conviction, in our clarity, and they want to see the Southern Baptist Convention be a strong force for truth in our culture. And again, that is not an anti-immigrant position. We care about people. You care about people of every race and every color and every tribe, but having laws and doing things in a just manner, that benefits everyone, including our American neighbors, and we should care about our American neighbors. Illegal immigration is a threat to so many people, and we know why it's being done. We know either through direct manipulation or incompetence. We know what happened in the last administration. Millions of people flooded across the border. That is not good for them. That is not good for American citizens, and that is not good for our future. We have to have a better way. And this administration at least is trying to enforce the laws, and I'm grateful they are, and I think we ought to pray for them. They may not get every single thing right, but we need to enforce the laws if we're going to have an orderly process, and we need an orderly process.
Yeah, well said. So one of the things that I've spoken out about quite a bit with Center for Baptist Leadership, and really is sort of integral to our vision and our mission, is that the Southern Baptist Convention has a role to play in American public life. Right. I'm so thankful for the Southern Baptist Convention and the missionaries we send, and for the churches we plant, for the evangelism we do, and the discipleship that happens in our local churches. I'm a part of that. I'm thankful for my local church. But there has been, over the last many years, sort of this almost spiritual and sort of political natural world bifurcation, where we talk about being on mission. And I think sometimes we forget that we are on mission somewhere. And for the vast majority of us, the place we're on mission is the United States of America. And what happens here matters. And when you see how big the Southern Baptist Convention is compared to other denominations, I had somebody jokingly mention to me, remind me, there are more Wiccans in America than there are PCAs, like PCAers, right? So it's like we talk about the SBC and the PCA as sort of the two main conservative denominations, but the PCA is just so much smaller compared to us. I'm not knocking them, I'm just stating the numbers. The Southern Baptist Convention could play, I would say, a really big role in the renewal of America. What's your thought on that? Can we do that? Can we walk and chew gum? Can we be mission minded and public minded as well? And what does that look like?
Yeah, we have to. We have to. And yes, we can. This is one of the biggest places you see the drift. The dominant message of the last, I'll just say 20 years. I'm not trying to fix it in a single person or a single moment, but the dominant message over the last 20 years was to pull us out of political, cultural debates. It was a fruit of pragmatism and a missiological strategy. Again, you've talked a lot about the third way, and it's kind of been diagnosed to death, but and it can be defined different ways, but it's God's not on the right or the left, words that I myself have used, and that there's an element of truth in that. Of course, God isn't bound by changing political definitions, but that whole idea of we're going to be quiet about the cultural political issues. We're going to be, in essence, apolitical. Well, let me tell you, it didn't work missiologically. It didn't make us more effective. It wasn't that all of a sudden people from the cultural and moral left started flooding in our churches because they thought we were nice, because it didn't work. What it did, ironically, is there's a whole mission field out there that was looking to the church for courage and conviction in a moment of cultural confusion. And what they heard in many of our institutions were we were as weak as other institutions. In reality, we missed a missiological opportunity by being bold and courageous about political cultural, moral issues. So one of the things I've called for, we put up a little website called baptistrenewal.us, and I've talked about 7 pillars of Baptist renewal, and one of those is cultural responsibility. We've got to reclaim our responsibility to speak prophetically into the culture. We cannot be afraid of hot button issues. We cannot be afraid of political issues. We're not a handmaiden for either party, but we must fulfill our role to speak truth to a culture that desperately needs to see an institution that is not going to waver. And too often, under the heading of missiological effectiveness, we were told to be. I can quote the people who told me. I can quote, and I think they meant it sincerely, that we're not culture warriors. We are to be gospel missionaries, as if you must choose A or B. But the reality is, several people have demonstrated, I'm thinking of Charlie Kirk here, several people demonstrated that when you have the courage to speak into cultural and moral issues, it actually opens the door to greater gospel effectiveness. Our culture needs an institution that is grounded in the truth and unafraid of the mob. And if the Southern Baptist Convention can rise up and reclaim that prophetic mantle, it can have a powerful impact in our culture, and it needs to happen.
Oh, praise God for that vision, Willie. That's very encouraging. I agree completely. And really just makes me think this is what it means to be salt and light.
Yeah.
Salt and light. Let's stop hiding our light under a bushel. And also, and I know you know this, that the way that messaging worked, where they told us not to be political, actually almost always was either overt or softly political to the left.
Absolutely.
Right? Don't be political, but here on this moral issue that appeases the left, actually you can be political. We've talked with Joe Rigney on this show before about how, sometimes it's okay to just call balls and strikes. And if the cultural right wing is biblically and morally correct on an issue, we don't have to pretend like they're not. Like what happened yesterday. So with just the last few minutes here, Willie, sort of what would be your encouragement to all the Southern Baptist churches that watched this yesterday? Any final words of encouragement for City's church?
We've talked about a wake-up call. I mean, first, on a practical level, I think pastors need to beware. They need to be, there's a practical level that could be talked about: security, protection, preparation. You need to imagine this can and will. All of us have practiced for other unthinkable things, and we've tried to prepare about that. We need to be prepared for things like this going forward. But on the spiritual level, it just reminds us we are in a battle, and we are hated, and our message is not going to be loved by everybody. And we need to be prepared for a far more intense cultural battle than most of us have ever known in our life. Being faithful and being prophetic is going to demand it. And so it's time that we accept that God has put us here for this moment. It's time for us to step up to the plate. It's time for us to wake up. We cannot be silent. We cannot be neutral. We have to be bold. We have to be strong. We have to be courageous.
Amen. Willie, where can people keep up with the work that you're doing in general and learn more about why you want to be our next president of the Southern Baptist Convention?
We put that website, baptistrenewal.us. baptistrenewal.us. We put the 7 pillars, well, we're calling 7 pillars of Baptist renewal. And that's what we're praying for. It's not about an election or a person. It's about a movement that we all need. And it's much bigger than a man. We need a movement. So we need a renewal. And I think that on that website, we put 7 pillars of renewal. And as the spring goes along, we'll be posting more things there. There's some podcasts we've done, some messages we've shared, so people can learn a little bit more about me. And there's even a way to communicate with us as we go through this spring and we talk about what a Baptist renewal is going to look like.
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing you out there everywhere else, and hopefully back here to talk more specifically about the Southern Baptist Convention in the months to come. Thank you for your courageous leadership. I really appreciated some of the things you said. I would be remiss not to mention, just because I'm such an anti-communist, I really liked your post where you said communists doing communist things. I mean, that's really that's the kind of leadership we need. So, Willie, thanks for joining. I'm gonna hide you from the show, and then you watch your little upload ticker there, and once it hits 100%, you can close out. Thanks for joining us, Willie.
Appreciate you.
Thank you. All right, that was incredible chance to hear from Willy Rice down there in Florida. and a bold call for Baptists to wake up, to stand up, and to be a force for good in the public square once again, to break out of this neither right nor left paradigm, but just speak bold biblical and moral truths regardless of where they land. And the truth is, they're going to land with the right more often than the left, a lot more often than the left today, because it's not the right that's storming churches. And throughout church history, we know, throughout all of human history, we know that the people storming the churches are not the good guys. Well, our last guest for today is another former guest of the Center for Baptist Leadership, a good friend of the Center for Baptist Leadership, and that is Megan Basham. So I'm going to let Megan in here. Megan, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Hey, William, thanks for having me. I'm good.
Good. Well, Megan, glad to have you back on the show. I'm sure it's been a busy day for you. I saw you already had an article
crazy
up.
Day. I've been wanting, from one place to another, like gathering pieces of information on this story. So it's very much a live developing story.
Great. Well, Megan, before we jump into anything on the story, you've shared quite a bit about your personal battle with cancer on social media. Any health updates or prayer updates for our listeners and for those many, many thousands of Christians out there who are praying for you and rooting for you in this?
Thank you for asking. So I have surgery on February 3rd, thoracic surgery. They're going to take off a little part of my lung, and that has what we believe is a metastatic nodule. So hopefully that will halt this from spreading any further, and that will be the end of my cancer journey. But that does mean stage 4. So, that does lessen my odds. So I appreciate those prayers. And I'm actually looking into getting some treatment from Patrick Soon-Shiong's clinic in California. So hopefully that too will help me beat this cancer.
Well, thank you for continuing to work through it. We need your voice, and pray that the Lord gives you strength. So that surgery is February 3rd.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right.
Okay. Well, folks, make sure to keep Megan in your prayers for the next few weeks, and particularly on February 3rd. But you've not let cancer hold you back. So you had a story today at the Daily Wire connecting what happened at City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota, to some other protest demonstrations. And I hate calling them protests because they're so much worse than that. Agitators, disruptors, attacks. Attack's a pretty good word. So just talk to us briefly about that connection you found between some of these protests in DC and what happened yesterday at City's Church in Minnesota.
Yeah, I think we're getting very close to the point where we can call these domestic terrorists, because when you're storming into a church in the middle of service and you're terrorizing the congregants, you're screaming in their faces. I don't know if people have seen all of these videos, but you really should, because it's appalling. And part of what they did was, make the kids that were sitting in the service cry. I was told that the kids in particular were terrified and they had to shut down the service. And as I started looking around at, who are these protesters, I got in touch with our friend Joe Rigney, who was, of course, a founding pastor at City's Church and pastored there for, I think, about 7 years. And he was also helped plant Christ Church in DC and has preached there a number of times. And so he was able to tell me, hey, I recognize one of the key ringleaders there at that City's Church attack, a guy named William Kelly, who is a paid professional agitator. In fact, right now it's disturbing to see that he has a GoFundMe to continue these attacks on churches. And he specifically said that, he's doing it to attack, quote unquote, demons in these churches. And so he's raised $40,000 to continue this kind of harassment of Christians as they're trying to worship God. So he and his group, you will often see them standing on the streets in the Capitol outside of Christ Church, because War Secretary Pete Hegseth attends there. And those videos too are very appalling. They are screaming the F word, screaming obscenities at families as they're trying to enter the building, screaming at the children. At one point, I've been told that these amplification attacks, because, they're screaming through bullhorns, which they then further amplify, became so severe they actually shattered a church member's eardrum as he was trying to go into church, and he had to be rushed to the hospital. So, these aren't games. And Kelly was arrested, but he was quickly released. So he's back out on the streets to continue this kind of harassment and destruction. And, part of what's so disturbing is that we know that local Minnesota police were on the scene there at that church. They said they were monitoring the event, but they did not arrest anyone. So what you saw is clearly illegal, and yet Minnesota authorities did not arrest anyone. They said because they were trying to balance free speech rights against the rights of Christians to worship freely. But let's be very clear, your free speech rights do not extend to storming into a church and terrorizing and interrupting the service.
Yeah, wow. So this guy William Kelly, does he have an organization? Like, or it's just sort of it's him doing it?
Yeah, I'm still looking into William Kelly. One thing we know is that these particular protesters that he was with, at least, are associated with Black Lives Matter, and it's the Racial Something Network, but it's another racial grievance group. And so, this is the kind of people who had already been on the ground in Minneapolis. They're the same people who were protesting against George Floyd. And so what you see is a group who are funded by the left. We know where Black Lives Matter got its money, not just from left-wing foundations, but, also from just about every major corporate organization in the US, from Walmart to Nike. So they've been very flush with cash. And so, these guys are paid to do this. And what I have heard is that they have just been sitting in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, where these George Floyd protests took place, and they just look for any trigger to go out and cause mayhem. So, before it was George Floyd, now it's Renee Good. But if you actually listen to what they're saying in the sanctuary of City's Church or in these protests, they aren't there just to protest ICE. They don't have any, real legitimate grievances against ICE, because you saw them saying things like "hands up, don't shoot." So they were repeatedly chanting that in this sanctuary. And that's a debunked slogan. That's a claim that Michael Brown back in 2015 or 14 in Ferguson, Missouri, was shot while he had his hands up. And we now know that that was not true. He was actually charging at a police officer when he was shot. But the point is that that's the kind of people that these protesters are. They are not people who are legitimately expressing their grievance about Renee Good. They're just glomming on to any particular, event in public life that they can use as an excuse to get out there and riot and cause trouble.
Yeah, and to particularly target Christians,
Right.
right? I mean, that really seems to. I listened to some of the interviews that Don Lemon was doing with these agitators, domestic terrorists, if that holds up, right? And really, they're saying, you shouldn't feel comfortable, and even this guy's language of attacking demons, it's this total inversion of Christian morality. They're trying to claim the Christian moral high ground for doing things like invading a church and terrorizing children, disrupting a worship service. And you're absolutely right. Their so-called First Amendment right to protest, which they do have, but it ends directly at the door of the church. They do not have the right to walk in there and disrupt this church service.
Yeah, I mean, if they wanted to hang out on the sidewalk, then fine. But what you cannot do is enter the building and do what they did. So I have no doubt that, federal charges are going to be coming here soon.
Yeah, we talked to Will Chamberlain and Jon Whitehead earlier about that, and it certainly looks like the federal charges are coming. Megan, one of the things I wanted to bring you on to talk about is just fascinating that it was a BLM protest, right? So, like, the great BLM bug comes back to bite Southern Baptists, and I want to be very clear about this. So let's make sure we do this charitably and fairly. We're not victim blaming City's Church in any way, shape, or form. They didn't do anything to deserve this. This was horrible, completely unjustified. And yet it is remarkable, I think, to you and to me and other people to see that this is really the fruit of the ideologies that have been welcomed into the Southern Baptist Convention. This was a Southern Baptist Convention church. And this is a fruit of compromise with things like BLM and on issues like immigration and ICE. So, what are some of the ways that sort of Southern Baptists have sort of foolishly compromise with some of these ideologies that one day grow up like the snake and bite us in incidents like yesterday?
Right. Yeah. As you were talking, by the way, I was looking up what that other group is, and it's the Racial Justice Network. So we have Black Lives Matter and the Racial Justice Network are part of the paid activists who stormed this church. And I think that brings up a really good point, because while I'm unbelievably grieved to see what happened at City's Church, and I absolutely want to be clear about that this is an ordinary Southern Baptist church. We love them. These are our brothers and sisters. And that is part of why it has been so frustrating to see the leadership at the national level of the Southern Baptist Convention, because that kind of leadership is what has contributed to what we unfortunately saw in St. Paul yesterday morning. So, we could go back to J.D. Greear sort of haranguing Christians to use the phrase Black Lives Matter. When he was president of the Southern Baptist Convention, he said it was a gospel issue, that we needed to use the slogan Black Lives Matter. And he tried to claim that, well, I didn't align with Black Lives Matter. I just said we should use that slogan. But he did, in fact, say things like we need to overhaul our policing system and our criminal justice system because it's racially unjust and it's systemically racist. And so those were the kinds of things that contributed to empowering these organizations that are now terrorizing churches. And then even further than that, William, it was a little disturbing to me to see that our own Southern Baptist leadership issued a press release and an open statement back in April where they explicitly attacked the Trump administration, supposedly for its handling of ICE, and claiming that Christians are afraid of ICE and they're afraid of how ICE is going to come into churches. None of that was true. Let's be very clear. ICE has handled itself incredibly well when it's come to things like apprehending illegal immigrants and criminals who are connected with the church in some way. So they have sat in parking lots and they have worked with pastors and they have let them know, hey, we're out here. We'd like to interview some people. But at no point have they stormed into a church and raided it and started pulling people out of the church. They have done nothing like what we saw these agitators and these protesters do. And so that's why it's so disturbing when you see these statements. And I'll just read you a little bit of it. So this was the statement, that was put out in April by a number of leaders of various ethnic ministries within the Southern Baptist Convention. And we could have a talk about whether we should have these cordoned off ethnic ministries that aren't a part of the larger, broader body that we're interacting with. Should we have these little separate Asian ministries? And I don't know. That's something we can debate. But what they did was put out a statement with the ERLC and Brent Leatherwood, who was the head of it at the time. And they said that the threats of mass deportation by the Trump administration and its lack of assurance to churches that ICE agents will not enter churches to carry out immigration enforcement duties has caused fear to rise among both the guilty and the innocent. Attendance has dropped significantly, threatening religious liberty and immigrants' access to spiritual care in their local churches. So, none of these things were true. What they did was they took a prominent legacy media narrative that ICE was going to somehow be a threat to churches, and they magnified it and they amplified it. Brent Leatherwood went on to say, he's quoted in this statement, "I'm grateful that these pastors and leaders have put into words the experiences that so many of our fellow Southern Baptist brothers and sisters are living through right now." He says, many of these moves are consistent with elements of a comprehensive approach to border security. Yet, as these pastors have indicated, some of these actions are raising alarm and fear among those who are here legally. So what they were continuing to do, like I said, was just give aid and comfort to this anti-ICE narrative. And now we see what that has done. We have seen these agitators and these protesters, who Southern Baptist national leadership also coddled, have now invaded a church because they simply had a pastor on staff who also works for ICE, which is a perfectly biblical thing to do. It is biblical for a law enforcement officer to also work as a pastor. There is no reason that they should have been attacked for that. So that was a long spiel, but I hope that gives everybody the background so that they understand why it's so important to hold our Southern Baptist leaders accountable, because it does contribute to situations like this.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have seen for many years now, essentially national Southern Baptist leadership take a slightly Christianized version of the leftist narrative on immigration. I mean, and whether it's through the ERLC's work with the Evangelical Immigration Table, which congratulations on your work helping to get that severed.
You as well.
Yeah, but I remember there was a fairly prominent Southern Baptist pastor, I'm forgetting his name, I think it was in Tennessee, who he spoke to this from the pulpit, and we made a big deal out of it, where he was warning about ICE in churches. And really, it's like, you are giving aid and comfort, you're adopting the propaganda of the enemy, when push comes to shove. What's really going to happen here are these Black Lives Matter, these leftists, these anti-ICE protesters are the ones who are going to be invading your churches instead. And so it's really important we flip the script. And Megan, do you think it's flipping? I mean, as you watch sort of the reaction to this, one of the things I said was, hey, look, it's great to see some of the big EVA SBC guys denounce this, but do they realize they've contributed to it? Is the culture going to actually change here? Are we winning? Are we losing? Are we in a draw? What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, I do think some things are shifting because, one, Brent Leatherwood is obviously not at the ERLC anymore. So, I think message received, and, he was a protege of Russell Moore, who did what Leatherwood did, but on steroids. So, he really furthered this leftist messaging. So I think the fact that, first Russell Moore left and then Brent Leatherwood quietly exited. So now we're in a moment, and I hope the ERLC sees this, and I hope they're listening, because the actions of that particular entity have been particularly odious to a lot of rank and file Southern Baptists, undermining what we believe and what we feel. And I can understand that, certain individuals at the ERLC may have different convictions on some of these political issues. And I'm the first to say that a lot of them are debatable. And I'm happy to have those debates about what our immigration policy should look like. But what they shouldn't feel free to do is what they did in this statement, for example, which is denigrate ICE and further a false narrative that ICE is somehow a threat to churches, which is what they did. So I hope they are listening and they are aware that, look, we're going to keep talking about this kind of thing if you continue to do it. So what I'm hoping to see is when they select a new leader for the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, that man better represent the views of all Southern Baptists and no longer just the very actually small slice of Southern Baptists who tend to be squishier or on the more progressive side. So, that's one. I also have seen what I think we've kind of dubbed the Great Rehab Tour, where you see some of these leaders like J.D. Greear, who accommodated Black Lives Matter and other racial grievance groups in the past. They're now trying to sort of reset and reframe their records, and they're trying to claim like, I wasn't really a part of that, or I didn't really do that, which is funny because I go, if you believed in it, why don't you just say, yes, I believe that, and I still believe that, and I'm going to double down on it and tell you why this is where I stand, because I'm never afraid to do that. I'm always happy to tell you, hey, this is where I stand, this is why. And even if everyone else doesn't like it, I'm still going to stand here if I believe it's true. And that's not what you see with leaders like J.D. Greear and some of his compatriots who are now quickly trying to, reposition themselves and go, actually, we were over here the whole time, and you're misunderstanding what we meant when we said things like use the Black Lives Matter slogan, or when we did the same things that all of these racial grievance groups were doing, which was tear down statues and American history. We also saw Greear do things like try to erase Southern Baptist history by retiring the broadest gavel because it had once been owned by a pastor who was in the antebellum era of the South, though he did later repudiate slavery. So, we've seen things like that, and that is a positive. So I want to encourage that. But at the same time, I do feel like we need a change in leadership. I appreciate if those guys want to get, with the zeitgeist now, and they want to move themselves over to where it seems like Southern Baptist culture, Christian culture, and the American culture more broadly is going. But that is not enough for me. I'm glad, unless maybe if they came out and repented, if someone like a J.D. Greear or a Danny Akin or some of these other guys would come out and say, you know what, we got caught up in a moment, and it was a mistake, and it was wrong, and we lacked discernment in that moment, and we refused to listen. We were very hard-headed about those who were trying to tell us how this conflicted with biblical principle, and who were trying to explain to us, people who had a little more knowledge of these organizations and what they stood for. We were arrogant and hard-headed, and we didn't listen to them. If they said that and said, we realize that now, and we ask for forgiveness and we repent, I would be the first to do it. I would welcome that, but we haven't seen that. All we've seen is denial and repositioning. So, to me, that means that this continued effort to change the leadership at the Southern Baptist Convention needs to continue.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. It really is a multi-year fight. What's happening in the SBC is sort of similar to what's going on with Trump world politics, right? When Trump won in 2016, that was not game, set, match. That was like the start of a multi-year effort. And then we got a setback, and now he's back. He's only been in for a year. I mean, we have a long way to go before we actually win anything. We are winning, but we have a long way to go until we win. Same with SBC, like this election coming up in Orlando, and with somebody like Willy Rice running, I mean, that would be a huge win, but it's not the final victory. I mean, it's the start. Even since I've been streaming here, I've had a couple of people reach out and flag for me that there's a local Baptist association that's sending around like pamphlets encouraging illegals to help avoid deportation. Like that's being sent around SBC associations. I hear that at NAM and Send Network that they're still talking about ministering to illegal aliens without any reference to deporting them. And so, I mean, even on this, I mean, I hope this is a flashpoint. You know, Megan, you are not just sort of an investigative reporter, you're also sort of like a cultural commentator, and you watch these things. You know, does an incident like yesterday, like how much will that go to sort of change things, or what would you say to people in terms of how it should change things? Because from what I understand, that church, it's not like the William Wolfe Church of pro ICE MAGA, right? And you look, that's not what my church is like anyway. But it's like, you know, whether that church was far right or sort of seeker sensitive, you know, third way, you're still going to get hit with this stuff. So like, you know, what's the message here for churches in terms of like, now is just a time to plant a flag, stay strong, because the left is not going to, the left at the end of the day isn't going to discriminate between J.D. Greer and William Wolfe and Megan Basham. They're coming for us all.
Right. And I think that's the good point that, you know, this was very much, as you said, I've been told as well, that this is not a culture warring type of church. I don't love that term, but you understand what I mean when I say that. This isn't this sort of pastor who writes op-eds in the New York Times or at the Daily Wire and is giving his political points of view. And we've all seen that, right? We've seen pastors who will be out there with protesters or who like to give interviews to media for various political positions, or who like to even attend rallies, whether for, you know, Democrats or Republicans. This is not that kind of church. This was just a church quietly going about its worship service. And so I think that shows, as you said, that you're going to be targeted. You may not want to get involved in this stuff, but they're going to force you to pick a side. And that's where this third way thing, we see why it doesn't work in real life, is that policy has to be chosen. So it's great to say, I don't align with the left or right, but policies are policies. There are specifics. So what is your position going to be on whether law enforcement is allowed to enforce our immigration laws? And that's what we've seen, is that this great effort to prevent them from doing what legally they are allowed to do and biblically they are sanctioned to do, which is ensure the safety of their own citizens and to ensure that, you know, we don't have rampant law breaking when it comes to our immigration system. So, you know, biblically, there is nothing wrong and everything right with what ICE is doing, and we should applaud them. And so, you know, that is really what I see here, is that you're not going to be able to avoid this, because even if you just have a member at your church who works for ICE or is an ICE official, eventually probably maybe somebody who's expressed views favorable of ICE, they're coming after you. So I don't remember who it was that said it, but that, you know, famous maxim that you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And that's not a dirty thing. That's the other thing I want to say. It is not a dirty thing for Christians to be involved in politics. The exact opposite. We have an obligation to work for the good of the cities that we live in. And part of that is ensuring law and order. So, you know, I see nothing inconsistent in everything that is consistent with supporting ICE and their immigration efforts. So, you know, I really hope that this serves as a wake-up call to a lot of great pastors out there who understandably, they don't want to be targeted with this. They don't want to have to speak up on this particular issue, but you may not have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we will ultimately have a choice, you know, and I would say, you know, I think you're saying this too, but I would say not only, of course, is ICE like legally, permitted to, like they're legally obligated to. So
Right.
ICE is legally obligated to remove, you know, illegals from the United States of America. And they're targeting, you know, they are targeting everybody, but they are targeting some of the worst of the worst, right? These are abusers, they're rapists, they're traffickers, they're drug traffickers, you know. Also, every time they throw up one of these rap sheets, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is who World Relief and Phil Vischer and Mike Cosper and Christianity Today, this is who you're defending. This is who you're telling me to welcome. This guy who has like abused an 11-year-old and has like 3 counts of drug trafficking. Like, this is who I'm supposed to side with over my American citizens. So not only are they legally, you know, commanded to, they're biblically commanded to too, right? Like, this is part of Romans 13, 1-7. And so with our last little bit of time here though, Megan, like, you know, a lot of people are familiar with your book, but, you know, one of the issues here is that for many years, the left has funneled tons of money into evangelical denominations, the Southern Baptist Convention in particular, to get us to essentially side with illegals over American citizens. So, you know, just remind us on some of those top points there of like this intentional effort to get the evangelical right to be anti-ICE, to be anti-immigration enforcement, what that's looked like, and sort of how we can be aware when it's happening to us.
Yeah, I can actually give you an example from just this weekend that kind of underlined the point of my book. I was visiting a Calvary Chapel church in Las Vegas, Calvary Red Rock. And, that's not a Southern Baptist church, but it is a biblically faithful, doctrinally sound denomination, Calvary churches. So, it was great to talk with them. And one of the things they told me, this was their pro-life conference, is that for a pro-life bill that is live right now in Nevada, they said Planned Parenthood and other groups have given millions of dollars to getting this piece of legislation across the line. And in the meantime, they are fighting it with like a mere 250 grand that they were able to raise. And so that has been kind of the consistent David and Goliath story that we have seen on so many of these issues throughout the church, is that you have these left-wing multi-billionaire organizations who are funneling money into these biblically debatable issues, things like immigration. They're pushing for open borders and amnesty policies, things like climate change legislation. They're pushing for, energy and fuel regulations. And so things that normally a conservative wouldn't want, but, they sort of cloak it in churchy language. They set up these AstroTurf front groups that always have the name evangelical in the title. So it'll be something like Evangelical Immigration Table or Evangelical Environmental Network. And, so this money comes from people like George Soros, the Clinton Foundation, the Rockefellers, and they disguise it as Bible studies and Bible study curriculum. And they're funneling it into churches through all of these ministries, including really large, well-known organizations like the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. They're pumping it onto Christian campuses with this funding from left-wing donors. And again, the ordinary people who tend to be much more conservative than their leadership has no idea that that's happening. So, suddenly they show up to church one Sunday morning and they find out, okay, we're going to do a series on loving our immigrant neighbor. And we're going to have these cherry-picked Bible verses that don't deal with passages in the Old Testament that say there are different kinds of immigrants. There are those who come to bless, but there are those who come to be a burden to the society, and you shouldn't take those who are coming to be a burden. And that immigrants must assimilate. They don't cover those passages. They're just dealing with a very surface level, cherry-picked welcome the stranger, which was a command to Christians, not to governments. So, that's the kind of thing that I cover in my book, and it's certainly part of the dynamic we see playing out here. And this is just another example, because these agitators that storm City's church are absolutely well funded through groups like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, and obviously through their own GoFundMe's too. I mean, it's just it's so crazy. Back to what you started with, that there's this guy going around in multiple jurisdictions, Washington, D.C., St. Paul, Minnesota, raising funds to agitate and to disrupt churches and Christians and conservatives. I mean, I hope the Department of Justice is listening to this and takes a look at that guy, right? It sounds like they're taking a look at other things. I feel like the response from the administration yesterday was incredibly positive. I mean, I have to say, it's a pretty big highlight of Center for Baptist Leadership to get reposted by the official ICE account, and Heartmeet Dylan as well. So, I mean, they were clearly paying attention. It wasn't just us. Tons of other people were engaging on this too. So
I didn't see that. I'll have to go look for it.
No, it's okay. So but there are a lot of people out there who are frustrated and want more. And we talked about this at the start of the hour, but sort of what would your sort of encouragement be to conservatives and to Christians out there as they're watching this and longing for justice, to let the Trump administration work? What do we do in the meantime?
One of the things I would really like to see, because I think there's this tendency from Christians and from churches that once the fiery moment has passed, they're like, let's just move on. But we actually do need to see justice done here so that these kind of incidents don't happen in the future. So, one of the first things I want to say is that people do need to be prosecuted and jailed here. This has to stop, because it's not just about you and your church. It's going to continue if you don't press charges to the full extent of the law. So, that's something I absolutely want to see. And I think that you are seeing an understandable frustration among conservatives who really want to see some action here. And I believe Harmeet Dillon and I believe Pam Bondi when they say that they are investigating and they're going to bring charges. But, they're fighting uphill because obviously Minnesota officials have made it clear they're not going to hold anyone responsible for this. So it's either going to be federal charges or nothing. And I think that absolutely needs to happen. But to the churches out there who are targeted, I really think I understand you don't want to be involved in this, but these prosecutions need to happen for the good of your neighbors. So please, don't drop the ball on this. Prosecute, ensure that people understand what happened at your church so that it doesn't happen to others.
Yeah, well said. I mean, really, the complete inverse of so much of what we have heard over the last decade is not love your neighbor, welcome the stranger. It's love your neighbor, support your local ICE agent.
Right.
Love your neighbor. Cheer on mass deportations. I mean, because really, these are the worst of the worst. And there's so many other things we could talk about. We'll have to have you back on sometime to talk about world relief and that whole
There's so
scam
much
and
to say.
gambit
Yeah.
there. But thank you so much for joining us. Megan, where can people keep up with what you're doing, your reporting, and everything else you're producing here?
Yeah, so you can always find me at Daily Wire. Had some breaking reporting yesterday on this story, and Morning Wire, which is our daily news podcast, 15 minutes straight news. I'm there usually 3-4 times a week. And I'm on all social media, but I tend to hang around the most, somewhat addictively so, on X. So you can find me on X at Meg Basham.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Thank you so much for your work, folks. Make sure to pray for Megan, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind hearing a friendly note that you are praying for here in the weeks ahead. All right, Megan, take care. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
All right, folks, thank you so much for staying with us here for the last 2 hours. It's a one-man band here. I'm trying to run it while I'm hosting it. And I'm not sure if we got cut off on X or not. That's not clear to me. I think the live stream held on YouTube all the way through, and hopefully we'll get it cleaned up, packaged up, and put back up on X and other channels. If it did get dropped there, not sure yet. But, there's so much more we could talk about. Obviously, this really was a watershed moment in American civic and religious life. The left is coming for us. There's no question about it. And as Southern Baptists, as Christians, as American citizens and patriots, we need to be clear-eyed about the threat that the left poses. And we really cannot make any compromise with evil. These are not people who will be reasoned with. These are people who, if they are not prevented by law enforcement, by the sword of the state, they are going to disrupt our churches. They are going to disrupt our cities and our communities. They're going to get people hurt. They're going to get people killed. And they are not the good guys. And really, it's time to leave behind this both sides equation that we were all discipled with over the last 20 years and say, if you're storming churches, you're the bad guy. And if that sounds partisan, I'm sorry, and I don't care. What fellowship can light have with darkness? And really, as we think about this situation, pray for the people of Minnesota, pray for the people of Minneapolis, pray for the people of St. Paul, pray for City Church, pray for their leadership. I'm sure yesterday was a huge shock to them as they're processing this, as they prepare this week to meet again next week in defiance of these protesters, to proclaim, as we do as Christians every Sunday, that Christ is risen, and that means something, that Christ is currently reigning over all earthly powers, as we're taught in Philippians 2, and that one day, it's not a question of if, but it's a matter of when every knee will bow and proclaim that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Don Lemon will proclaim that. Every protester yesterday will proclaim that. And pray, genuinely pray that they repent and believe. I do hope many of them go to jail. I think that's a good thing to hope. I hope they're prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and that also they repent and believe. This is why God gives us both government and the church in different authorities, with different authorities doing different things, one enacting justice, the other administering the gospel. Those are not in tension. We can hope and pray that all of these protesters, these agitators, these domestic terrorists are found and prosecuted and arrested and go to jail. And we can also hope and pray that they repent of their sins and they believe in Jesus Christ and they're baptized and join a church. And one day they can stand up in a church and share a testimony like, I protested in a church and the Lord used that to get a hold of me and lead me to new life and forgiveness and salvation in Jesus Christ. You can hope for both of those things. And I would warn you against religious leaders out there, people, Big Eva, etc., who pit those against each other. They're not in tension. Now is the time in American religious life and American political life to hold both of those very clearly and to demand justice. David Mitzenmacher had a great article today at Center for Baptist Leadership calling on the state to do its duty under God to defend worship. It's not a suggestion, it's a command. They need to defend the worship of Christians in the United States of America. So we'll continue to cover this. I'm sure we'll have other articles as well. So make sure to visit us at centerforbaptistleadership.org. Please make sure to subscribe to this podcast on all your podcast platforms, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. If you're a regular listener, I would ask that you leave us a 5-star review. We've had some people who don't like the work that we do try to tank us in the reviews and rating system. So if you're a regular listener, leave us a 5-star review. That would help. If you're a Southern Baptist out there, a Southern Baptist pastor who is dealing with anything like this and you want help, please reach out. I'm always happy to help. That's what we're here to do at Center for Baptist Leadership. We're here to come alongside you, to put wind in your sails, steel in your spine as we face these incredibly momentous incidents in American public life. We need courageous Baptist leadership for the 21st century. Willy Rice absolutely nailed that in our segment today. And so, folks, really appreciate you staying with us through all of this. And make sure to check us out, like and subscribe, share with all your friends. Let me see if I can play this closer for us. Let's see if it'll play. All right, it's played. Have a good day, folks.
The Center for Baptist Leadership podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.